Источник. Daniel almost didn't check the message. It had come in on a Thursday evening while he was making dinner, a number he recognized as his cousin Patty's, which he hadn't seen on his screen in close to 2 years. He'd looked at it, set his phone face down on the counter, finished cooking, eaten, washed the dishes, and watched 40 minutes of something on television that he couldn't have described afterward. Then he picked up the phone. "Hey, Daniel. I know it's been a while. I wanted to reach out because I talked to Michael last week. He's been asking about you. I think he wants to connect. Just thought you should know. No pressure. Call me if you want to talk." He read it twice. Then he put the phone on the charger, went to bed, and lay in the dark for a long time telling himself he'd deal with it in the morning, which was what he said about things he didn't want to deal with at all. He and Michael had not spoken, really spoken, the kind that required more than a text, in 6 years. The math of that was something Daniel avoided doing in any concentrated way. 6 years. He was 44. Michael was 47. 6 years put the fight at 2017, which meant it had happened when their mother was still alive, which meant there had been more than 2 years before her death where they'd been in the same rooms at her house and managed it with the specific cordiality of people who have agreed without discussing it to maintain a surface. The fight had been about the house, not this house, Daniel's apartment, which he'd lived in alone since his divorce. Their mother's house, which had needed a decision after it became clear she could no longer manage it alone. Michael had thought she should sell and move closer to him in Portland, where he'd lived for 15 years with his wife and their life. Daniel had thought she should stay in Cincinnati, where she'd spent 40 years, and where her friends were and where he was, 20 minutes away. They'd both been right. That was the intolerable thing. They'd both had real reasons and real care underneath the positions, and neither of them had been able to hear it in the other, because by the time they were arguing about the house, they were also arguing about everything else. Who had been closer? Who had contributed more? Who understood their mother better? Whose version of the family was the correct version? And the house had just been the container for all of that. Their mother had stayed in Cincinnati. She'd died there, in her own house, in 2019, with Daniel 20 minutes away and Michael on a plane that landed 4 hours too late. That was another thing neither of them had been able to discuss, what it meant, what it cost, who it cost more. The texts after that had been functional. The estate, the arrangements, a few logistical exchanges that required information but not conversation. And then those had thinned out too, and 6 years had accumulated, and Daniel had built a life in which his brother existed at a careful distance, which had become, not comfortable, that was the wrong word, familiar, like a bruise in a place you'd learned not to press. He called Patty on Saturday morning. She answered on the second ring, which meant she'd been expecting him. "Hey," she said. "Thanks for calling back. Sorry it took a couple days." "It's okay." She paused. "How are you?" "Fine. Good." Neither of those things was the point. What's going on with Michael? Patty was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that meant she was deciding how to say something. "He's okay," she said. "He had a health scare a few months ago. He's okay now. They caught it. He's being monitored, but it shook him up. I think it shook him up pretty good." She paused. "He didn't make a big deal of it with family. You know how he is. But he mentioned you. He said he'd been thinking about you." Daniel was looking out the window of his apartment. It was a gray November morning, the kind without any particular quality except gray. What kind of health scare? She told him. He listened. It was serious enough, and not as serious as the word scare had made him fear, and the two things coexisted the way two things can. He wanted to reach out himself, Patty said. "I think he started to a few times, but you know how it gets. When something's been..." She stopped. "He mentioned he'd said some things. In the fight." "We both said things. I know. I just wanted you to hear that he knows that." Daniel didn't say anything for a moment. "I'll think about it," he said. He thought about it for 3 weeks. This was the thing about Daniel that he would have been the last to describe as a problem. He was thorough. He thought things through. He didn't act on impulse. He'd been this way since he was a kid. The brother who waited to see how something would unfold before he committed. The one who processed. It had served him in his career. He was a structural engineer, a profession that rewarded not rushing. And it had served him in some ways in his personal life, and had not served him at all in others. The divorce had a piece of this in it. His ex-wife, Linda, had said something in one of their last real conversations that he'd thought about since, more than he'd expected to. She'd said, "You're very good at analyzing a situation, Daniel. What you have trouble with is letting it cost you something." He thought that was unfair at the time. He thought about it now, on a Saturday afternoon in November, standing in the kitchen making coffee. The 3 weeks hadn't been nothing. He'd drafted 2 messages to Michael and deleted them both. The first had been too much, too comprehensive, too organized, too much like he was building a case rather than reaching across a 6-year space. The second had been too little, too careful, a check-in that communicated nothing except that he was willing to communicate nothing. He'd found the photograph in the middle of the 2nd week. He hadn't been looking for it. He'd been going through a box of things that had come from his mother's house, a box that had sat in his closet for 5 years, because that was the kind of thing you could do with a box. You could just close the closet door and not revisit it. And the photograph had been between 2 other photographs, unremarkable in its placement. It was from a camping trip. He and Michael must have been... Michael would have been about 20, which put Daniel at 17. They were standing at a trailhead somewhere in Kentucky, both squinting at the camera, both wearing the particular fashion mistakes of that decade, both grinning with the unself-conscious ease of people who have just spent a week outside and are slightly sunburned and too tired to perform. Daniel had looked at the photograph for a long time. He'd been trying, for 6 years, to think about Michael as the person from the fight, the person who'd said certain things in a certain tone, who'd pushed a position past the point of good faith, who'd made Daniel feel dismissed and irrelevant. He'd gotten very good at that. He'd refined it. When Michael's name came up, the fight was what surfaced first, and then the years of careful distance, and then the functional texts about the estate, and none of it was incorrect exactly. All of it had happened. But it was also not the person standing at the trailhead, squinting at a camera. That person had taught Daniel to drive a stick shift in an empty parking lot on a Sunday afternoon, patient to the point of sainthood while Daniel ground the gears. That person had called him when the divorce went through, just called, no warning, and said, "I know this is a bad time. I just wanted to hear your voice," which was not the kind of thing either of them said usually, and which Daniel had not forgotten. That person had been in his life for 44 years. He'd let the photograph sit on his kitchen counter for 5 days. He looked at it every morning. He didn't make a decision. He told himself he wasn't making a decision. Then Patty called again. Not to pressure, she wasn't that kind of person. Just to say that Michael had mentioned wanting to tell him something he'd apparently been thinking about since the health scare, and that she'd said she'd pass it along, and she had. "What does he want to tell me?" Daniel asked. "I don't know," Patty said. "He didn't say. He just said there was something he'd wanted to say for a long time and that... I don't know, Daniel. He said he didn't want to wait anymore." Daniel sat with this after he hung up. He didn't want to wait anymore. The thing about that was it implied that waiting was a choice. That time was not just passing, but being spent. He'd been aware of this on some level for 6 years, and had not let himself look at it directly, because looking at it directly would have required admitting that the not calling, the not going, the not finding the moment was not being careful or being principled or waiting for the right time. It was just not going. He was afraid. That was the plain center of it, not of Michael, not of the fight, not even of being wrong. Afraid of the conversation itself, of what it would require him to say out loud, of standing in a room with his brother and trying to speak honestly when they'd spent 6 years not doing that. Pride had been the story he'd told himself. He knows where I am. He could call. He said what he said, and I'm not pretending that didn't happen. But pride was just the costume for the fear. Underneath it, he was a man who didn't want to be the one who tried and had it not go well, who didn't want to extend himself and find the distance had become permanent, who didn't want to know for certain what he could currently avoid knowing. The photograph was on the counter. The man at the trailhead, 20 years old, squinting at the camera. Daniel booked a flight to Portland on a Sunday evening. He didn't announce it in advance. He called Michael directly, the actual number, and listened to it ring 3 times. And when Michael picked up and said, "Hello?" Slightly cautious, the voice of someone who hadn't expected this, Daniel said, "It's me. I'm coming up this weekend, if that's okay." Silence. "Yeah," Michael said. "Yeah, of course that's okay." They didn't talk long. There was some logistics. Which airport, what time. Michael said he'd pick him up. And then a pause. And then Michael said, "Daniel," and then didn't say anything else for a moment. "I know," Daniel said. "We should have." "I know." They left it there. There would be time for the rest of it. If you know this particular weight, the pride that keeps you from something you actually want to do, stay with this, because what happens next is the part that matters. And subscribe if this is where you come for these stories. We'll be here. He flew up on a Friday evening. Michael was at the arrivals area, standing a little apart from the people meeting other people, wearing a jacket Daniel didn't recognize, which meant nothing except that 6 years was long enough to buy a new jacket. He looked the same, older than the last time, which was expected, but substantially the same. The set of the shoulders, the way he stood with his weight slightly forward, the particular Michaelness that Daniel had known his whole life and had been pretending for 6 years he'd successfully filed away. They did the thing brothers do at airports. Brief, firm, a hand on the shoulder. Not cold, but not yet what they were going to be by the end of the weekend. A beginning of a beginning. "Good flight?" Michael said. "Fine. Short." "Good." He picked up Daniel's bag before Daniel could, which was something he'd always done, automatic, and neither of them commented on it. In the car, they talked about nothing particular for the first 10 minutes. The traffic, the airport, Portland's November weather, which was significantly worse than Cincinnati's November weather. Safe territory. Both of them knew it was safe territory, and both of them were in it voluntarily, because you have to start somewhere. Michael's house was a craftsman in a neighborhood Daniel had never seen, because he'd never come to Portland, because there had always been a reason not to. It was a good house, a home, actually. The specific feeling of rooms that have been lived in thoughtfully, with food cooking somewhere, and the particular disorder of a real life. His sister-in-law Beth hugged him at the door. She'd always been warm, and she was warm now, and he was grateful for it, grateful for the presence of a third person in the first hour, a bridge. They had dinner. The 4 of them, Beth, Michael, Daniel, and their daughter Amy, who was 21 and home from college for the weekend, and seemed genuinely pleased to see her uncle, which did something to Daniel he hadn't expected. After dinner, Beth and Amy found reasons to be elsewhere, in the quiet way of people who understand that something else needs to happen. Daniel and Michael sat at the kitchen table. There was a bottle of whiskey on the table that had appeared without announcement. Michael poured 2 glasses. They sat with the glasses in front of them for a moment. "So," Michael said. "So," said Daniel. A pause. "How are you?" Daniel said. "Actually..." Michael looked at his glass. "Better. They're watching it closely. They think they got it early." He turned the glass slightly in his hand. "It was a strange few months. I kept thinking about things." Patty said, "I figured she'd tell you. I asked her to." He looked up. "I didn't know how to call you myself. I started to about 4 times." "I know. I did the same thing." Michael was quiet for a moment. "You did?" 3 times. I deleted them. Something shifted in Michael's face. Not much, just slightly. "I thought..." He stopped. "I thought you'd decided you were done with me." "I thought you'd decided the same thing." They sat with this for a moment. 6 years of each of them reading distance as finality, which was what distance does if you let it go long enough. It starts to look like intention. The fight, Michael said. Yeah. I said things I shouldn't have. So did I. I know, but I said them first. He wrapped both hands around his glass. What I said about you not being there for her the right way, that wasn't... I know you were there. I know you drove her to every appointment. I know what that cost you, and I said it like it wasn't enough, and it was wrong. Daniel absorbed this. He'd been waiting 6 years to hear it said, or something like it, and it was different than he'd expected. Not vindicating, not relieving, just true. A true thing that had needed to be said. I made you feel like you didn't know her, Daniel said. The Portland thing. I said you'd been gone so long you didn't understand what she needed anymore. That was... He stopped. You knew her. You'd been gone for work. That's different than not knowing someone. Michael looked at him for a moment. I didn't make it to her in time, he said quietly. I know. I've thought about that every day for 5 years. Michael. I've thought about whether she knew I was coming. He looked at the table, whether it mattered. Daniel thought about his mother in the last hours. He'd been there. He'd held her hand. She'd known he was there. She'd asked about Michael, and he'd said Michael was on his way, which was true. And she'd nodded and closed her eyes, and he'd stayed until it was over. She knew you were coming, Daniel said. I told her. She nodded. He paused. She asked me to tell you something. Michael looked at him. She said to tell you the Portland summer was her favorite. He hadn't planned to say this tonight. He'd been carrying it for 5 years, waiting for the right moment, which had not arrived because he'd been careful to be in rooms where the right moment couldn't find him. She visited you the summer you first moved there, 2004. She said it was the first time she'd seen you fully in your own life, and it made her happy. Michael was quiet for a long moment. He nodded once, slowly. His jaw was tight. Okay, he said. They sat for a while without talking, which was its own kind of talking. The whiskey was good and they had more of it, and the night moved slowly in the way of nights when something real is happening. They talked about the fight and then through it, circling around the edges of the original wound and not trying to make it simpler than it was, because it wasn't simple. There had been real injury in both directions, and real miscommunication, and real love in strange amounts on both sides all along. Michael said he'd wanted to tell Daniel something. He'd mentioned it to Patty. Yeah, Daniel said. She said, what was it? I wanted to tell you that I was sorry I wasn't a better brother while Dad was sick. He said it looking at the table. That was before any of this, before Mom. You handled a lot of that alone too, and I was younger and I told myself you had it handled. I've thought about that more recently. That was the beginning of the pattern, maybe. Daniel thought about their father's illness, which had been 30+ years ago. He hadn't thought about Michael's absence from that the way he'd thought about other things. He'd just absorbed it and moved forward. I was 22, Michael said. It was not a good reason. It was just a reason. We were both young. You were younger. This was true. Daniel had been 19. He'd been home from his first year of college when their father's diagnosis came through, and he'd stayed. Michael had been in his second year of graduate school in another city and had come home when he could, which was sometimes, which was less than Daniel had. He hadn't thought of it as a wound exactly, but sitting here now he could see that it was something, a shape of pattern that had repeated, different circumstances and different ages, but the same essential structure. Michael at a distance, Daniel present and carrying more than his share and not naming it, and the not naming becoming its own resentment. I've done it twice, Michael said. That's the thing I've been sitting with. Not just with Mom. I did a version of the same thing with Dad, and I never acknowledged that to you. And then when Mom got sick, you were right there like you always are, And I'm in Portland, and I made it about the house decision instead of about... He stopped. I was ashamed that you were the one there, and I wasn't. And instead of saying that, I started arguing about the decision, which was easier. Daniel sat with this. It was not a simple reframe. It didn't erase the fight, didn't make the things Michael had said untrue. But it added something to the picture, a depth Daniel hadn't had access to because they'd never talked past the surface of it. Why didn't you say that at the time? He asked. Because I didn't know how. And because being ashamed of something is easier to argue against than to admit. Michael looked at him. You're better at being present. You always have been. I've spent a long time calling it you being the homebody, the one who didn't leave. But it's not that. You show up. I've had a harder time with it. You showed up this weekend, Daniel said. Michael looked at him. You called Patty. You told her to reach out. You opened the door. Daniel shrugged. That showing up, Michael was quiet. It almost didn't happen, Daniel said. I almost didn't call back. I know. I figured. I sat on it for 3 weeks. Same. Michael almost smiled. We're very efficient. Daniel did smile at that. A real one. The first one of the evening. And it opened something. They stayed up until close to midnight, which was late for both of them, which neither of them mentioned. They talked about their mother and their father and the camping trip in the photograph, which Daniel had brought with him, which he produced from his bag at some point and set on the table between them. Michael looked at it for a long moment. I forgot that trip, Michael said. I didn't. Daniel looked at the two of them squinting at the camera. I've been looking at this one for the past week. Michael looked at him. That's why I called, Daniel said, simply. Michael nodded. He looked at the photograph for another moment, then left it on the table. Daniel slept in the guest room that night, and in the morning Beth made breakfast, and Amy came down late and joined them, and they sat around the kitchen table for a long time over coffee and food, and nothing in particular, the four of them. And it was ordinary in the way that ordinary is sometimes the thing you've been missing, without knowing what to call it. He flew home Sunday afternoon. Michael drove him to the airport, and they said goodbye in the arrivals area. And it was different from when they'd arrived 2 days before. Not resolved, not fully repaired, not like the 6 years hadn't happened, but different in the way things are different after a door has actually been opened. They hugged properly. Michael put his hand on the back of Daniel's neck briefly, the way he'd done when they were young. Come for Christmas, Michael said. If you want. No pressure. But Beth said to ask. I'll think about it, Daniel said. Michael looked at him. I'll come, Daniel said. He flew home and sat at the kitchen window in the last of the Sunday light, the photograph on the counter in front of him. He thought about the years between that trailhead and this kitchen, the accumulation of them, the way 6 years had felt from inside it, like a kind of protection, like he was the one holding a position, keeping himself intact, and how it felt from this distance, like something else entirely. Time that had been spent, not saved. Years of Michael in Portland and Daniel here, and both of them in the same posture of waiting for the other to make it easier. The pride had felt like firmness, like knowing where you stood, like not letting yourself be pushed around. It had not felt like what it was, which was a man standing very still in a doorway while the years moved past him. He picked up his phone and texted Michael. Good flight. Thanks for the weekend. Michael texted back within a minute. Thanks for coming. And then, after a moment, I've got a camping spot in my head. Oregon coast. You'd have to fly here. Spring, maybe. Daniel looked at the photograph. The two of them squinting at the camera. 49 years old and 46. Plenty of time. He texted back. Let me know the dates. He put down the phone. He sat in the quiet of his apartment, which was his and which he knew well, and he thought about nothing in particular for a while, which was its own kind of rest, the rest of a person who has put something down that he'd been holding for 6 years and is only now feeling where it had been. He stopped saying he'd deal with things later. When the impulse came to reach, to his brother, to anyone he'd been at a distance from for the wrong reasons, he followed it while it was warm. It was not a dramatic change. Nobody watching from the outside would have named it, but from the inside, it was the difference between a closed door and one that was standing open, and he understood now that the open one was warmer, even in November, even with all the complications that came through it. He was glad he'd gone. He was glad he'd gone when he did. If there's someone you've been meaning to reach out to, not because things are perfect, not because you've resolved anything, but just because time is a real thing that moves, I hope this story gave you a nudge. Leave something in the comments if it landed. And if this is where you come for stories like this one, you know what to do. Take care of yourselves.